Badbird presents Seat of the Allfather. Written by J. Isaac. This is Episode 11, The Walkway. James put his hands casually on his hips and scanned the property.
I'm looking for someone.
Sully looked perplexed.
Looking for someone on my property?
He glanced at Georgia, then back at James.
Who?
James studied the two and considered the situation. This was not how he expected this to go.
It's a kid, about 14 and missing. I'm just asking around.
Georgia shook her head definitively.
It's just the two of us here. We haven't seen any kid.
Sully nodded in agreement.
That's true. But I gotta say, you look kind of, familiar. Do I know you from somewhere?
James shook his head.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Maybe, I can't be sure, but I feel like I've seen you before. You look awfully familiar.
Sully's brow began to furrow, but he held his smile. James cast a glance at the parked police car. He realized he wasn't going to make any headway in this manner.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be a bother. Just asking around.
James turned and headed back to his vehicle. Sully put his arm over George's shoulders and watched him go. The smile on his face began to dissolve. James was approaching his vehicle when a sound drew his gaze. It came from the tree line, 20 yards away to his left. He squinted through the dark, trying to make out the source. Suddenly, a dark shape skittered along the edge of the forest. James jerked back instinctively. The shape slowed and turned towards him. James gasped as it came into focus. It was a young child, roving about on its hands and feet. He could hear it panting, and it chirped and grunted like a feral creature, sniffing the air. James heard gravel crunch behind him, and the child leapt back into the forest. He whirled on his heel, simultaneously feeling a hard impact to the side of his head. James lost balance and fell to the ground, his ear ringing from the blow. He felt a hard kick land on his side, sending shards of agony through his body. James groaned and rolled onto his back, holding his ear to stop the ringing. Above him stood Sully, fists clenched.
I wish you hadn't seen that. Who the fuck are you, anyway?
In a flash, James rolled and kicked out the foot of the man standing over him. Sully staggered back, trying to regain his balance. He was too late. James was on his feet in an instant, charging towards the man like a freight train. In the last second before impact, James feinted left and cast his right fist into Sully's jaw. He followed with 3 lightning-fast hooks to the man's head. Left, right, left. Sully was reeling now, desperately trying to find stability. Georgia was suddenly on James' back, throwing a flurry of blows on his head and shoulders. James reached behind his back and gripped the handle of the knife tucked in his waistband. He drew it and spun, cutting upwards as he did so. Georgia stepped back and gasped. Her eyes were wide with horror as blood began to run. It dripped from the quivering line now drawn between her hip and chin. She collapsed. James whirled to face Sully, who was standing still and gaping at the dying woman. James flicked the blood off the tip of the blade, and the corner of his mouth turned up.
You made a big mistake tonight.
Sully set his jaw and lowered his posture. Suddenly, the far-off sound of baying caused both men to glance at the tree line. The sound was followed by a boy's scream, far off in the night. James recognized the sound. It was Max. Sully's foot twisted slightly in the gravel.
I'm not the only one.
James suddenly lunged forward and thrust the blade upwards towards Sully's heart. The man reacted on instinct, lifting his left arm to thwart the blow. The knife slid through the soft muscle on the top of his forearm and stopped. Sully roared and shoved the attacker off. The knife clattered to the ground in the scuffle, and then another scream echoed in from the woods. James glanced towards the sound, and then Sully was on him. James reached towards the ground and brought up a streaking uppercut towards his assailant. Sully twitched to the side, easily dodging the blow, returning with the right hook to James' solar plexus. James gasped and suddenly couldn't draw breath. He began to panic, throwing a series of wild swings at his attacker. Sully dodged them easily. He kept coming, seemingly growing like some unstoppable threat bent on James' destruction. A clenched teeth smile began to grow on Sully's face. His eyes were wide with a savage gleam. Suddenly, as James staggered back from Sully's onslaught, his foot landed on something soft. He tripped and landed on his back, seeing at once that it was Georgia's prostrate form that had tripped him. Sully lurched forward and then hesitated. His eyes were fixed on Georgia. James felt a lump under his hip, and he felt for it. A thrill passed through his body when he felt his fingers wrap around the hilt of his knife. He staggered to his feet, holding the knife out in front of him. Sully's posture relaxed. He looked at the knife, and then took one last glance at the dead woman. He began to back towards the house.
You're gonna die.
His voice was husky, and the words were spoken through clenched teeth. The man turned and began to run. Sully was headed towards the house, leaving a trail of fine red droplets behind him. James let him go. He tucked the blade back in its sheath behind his waistband and began to run in the direction where he had heard the boy's scream. The forest felt even colder than the air near the house. James could scarcely see where he was going, but he frantically followed the sound of the baying. He seemed to be getting closer. Branches slapped at his face, and thorns tugged at his clothing. The ground began to rise, and the trees thin. James could see the moonlight pouring down the hillside up ahead, seeping around the trees and pooling in shallow clearings. James felt blood seeping from his side wound, and his breath began to flag. Then up ahead, he saw something, a moving shadow near the top of the hill. Then another. Then nothing. He waited in the silence, alert, trying to regain his breath. A blood-curdling shriek rang out from behind the man, and he simultaneously felt a hard impact, knocking him over. Something was on top of him, hitting and slapping and smashing. A raking blow hit the back of his neck, and blood began to run freely from the draglines in his scalp. He finally managed to roll over, throwing his assailant off of him. Whoever it was, they didn't weigh much. He struggled to regain his footing. Then all was quiet. James blinked into the dark and felt the back of his neck, his fingers coming away from the wounds draped in scarlet. He heard heavy panting coming from the trees in front of him, but he could see nothing. Then a branch cracked. It was coming from lower down on the hill. A growl came from the bushes to his side. A low shadow seemed to break off from the night, and it began to approach. The moonlight illuminated bared teeth and black, dilated eyes. With a scream, it charged. James reached for his blade, but something hit him first from his left flank. It slammed him against a nearby tree, taking the wind out of him. Then the other assailant was on him, cutting and raking with fingernails, leaving broad tiger stripes across his face and exposed arm. He could barely see, but he swung reflexively into the dark. He felt it connect with something light, which stumbled back in response to the force. A choking sound followed. Then, a fist returned from the shadows. James reeled back at the impact, tripping over a fallen tree behind him. Something was on him anew. Something bigger. This one was delivering a volley of punishing blows to James' body and face. James weakly threw a blow upwards, but he could feel it being swatted away. He twisted and turned, trying to roll over to protect his face and neck. Fear and desperation were beginning to take hold. He struggled breathlessly beneath the weight of his assailant. Finally, with one last effort, James managed to roll over, his face now being pressed into the forest floor. The blows paused briefly, and a set of teeth clamped into the flesh at the nape of his neck. James screamed into the earth and bucked his body instinctively. He felt the weight on top of him lose its balance. James rolled back over and sent a desperate blow out into the dark. It made contact, and a grunt of pain followed. This was his chance. James staggered to his feet and began swinging and kicking like a madman. He finally was able to pinpoint his attacker in the dark, and he attacked viciously. Suddenly, the shape shifted, and James was left fighting against thin air. In a last, desperate attempt, he swung into the dark and felt something brush his arm. He seized what felt to be a wrist. Blinded by the dark, James resorted to instinct. He kicked low, where his assailant's knee ought to be. He felt contact, and the figure dropped to one leg. James swung his boot up high and planted it on the back of the figure, wrenching back and up with all his might on the arm he had within his grasp. A loud popping sound echoed through the trees, followed by an agonizing shriek. James dropped the arm and kicked hard. Then he ran. He had to get to Max. James instinctively began to run for the top of the hill, the only part of the forest that was even dimly lit. Heavy footsteps started up behind him just as he made the crest. A shot of adrenaline rammed into his heart when he heard the sound. He put on a fresh burst of speed and began the descent. Suddenly, his foot caught on a jutting stone, sending him flying headfirst down the hillside. He landed on his shoulder and continued tumbling. His head slammed into a rock. James' body continued its high-speed descent, falling and rolling down the steep hillside until he was stopped by the large trunk of a maple tree. The sound of ribs cracking coincided with the impact. His head swam as he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Max had finally reached the bottom of the hill. The sound of something making its way down the slope behind him could still be heard. The boy began feeling his way through the brush, eventually making his way back into the timber. The going got easier, and Max could see better now in the open space. Suddenly, he heard crunching footsteps 20 yards behind him. His heart rate spiked. He looked frantically around for cover. An enormous fallen tree was visible ahead, with brush grown around it. He crept over and concealed himself on the opposite side of the structure. The sounds of the approaching figure grew louder, until a form was visible. It was shuffling, alternating between a loping jog and a quick, skittering movement on all fours. Raspy panting flowed from the figure, and Max could see that it was looking back and forth through the woods, searching for something. It grew even closer, and began to sniff the air. Max was trembling. The figure stopped and drew upright. Max could see that it was small, child-sized. It was so close that he could reach out and touch it. His hands closed around the end of a broken branch at his feet. He thought that if he could hit fast enough, hard enough, the thing in front of him wouldn't be able to recover in time. That would give him a chance to escape, a chance to get out of these godforsaken woods. Suddenly, a man's scream pierced the forest silence. It was close. The figure's head twitched in the direction of the sound. Max bolted upright and struck as hard as he could. bringing the end of the branch down with a crack at the top of the figure's head. It let out a piercing squeal of agony and fell over on the ground, kicking its legs. It snorted and growled, and then began to pick itself up. Max watched in horror as it struggled to his feet, and then he realized who it was before him. It was the youngest girl. She faced him and let out a guttural scream. Max bolted. Clouds obscured the moon, suddenly casting the forest into a new level of darkness. Branches tugged at the boy's clothing as he ran. The sounds of physical conflict began to become apparent up ahead. Shouting, grunts, screams. Max turned slightly to avoid the scene, when suddenly he heard something. It made him stop.
Max.
It was his father's voice. He was saying it slowly, painfully. Max carefully started moving towards James' voice. The sound was coming from up ahead. The vehicle's headlights danced on the woman's body, now growing stiff in the cold night air. The old man's brow furrowed, and he rolled down the window slightly. From the depths of the woods, the sounds of cries and shouting could be heard. Long, mournful howls echoed out of the trees. The old man noted his parked Bronco off to the side of the driveway. He waited a moment and then backed out and continued down the forest road. He drove for a few minutes, finally rounding the large slope on the south side of the McEnroe's property. He parked his vehicle on the side of the road and headed into the trees. Up ahead, he could hear the sounds of a conflict. The old man's gait quickened. The sound grew louder and louder, and then suddenly stopped. The old man suddenly found himself on the edge of a small clearing, at the base of the slope. In the middle, a man was slumped over on his knees. A figure lay motionless on the ground, several yards in front of him. Behind the man crouched another figure, and it gnawed at the flesh of his neck and shoulder. The old man started at the sight, and he smelled the air, as if out of instinct. A perplexed expression grew on his face. Then, he stepped out of the trees.
Stop that!
The figure looked at him briefly, and then continued to feed.
I said stop!
The old man roared and began to stride forward. The figure drew upright and wiped its mouth. Its breathing was unnaturally fast, and it had observed the old man through glassy, dilated eyes. Then it charged. The old man roared and drew back his arm. His hand closed into a fist as he shot it forward, stopping the oncoming figure's momentum abruptly. The figure landed on its back, kicking its legs frantically to roll over. The old man stamped a boot on its chest, pinning it to the earth. His breathing then grew ragged. He stooped to seize the large stone on the ground.
When I tell you to do something, you do it! You fucking disappointment!
As he lifted the stone above his head, the moon suddenly appeared from behind the clouds. His hair flowed around his face, and it glowed like a wreath of crystal. The stone landed with a deep crunch. The old man rested for a moment with his knees on the boy's body. He let out a long, breathy sigh. Presently, he spoke, forming the words with a tone of reserved disappointment.
I withdraw my presence from you.
The old man stood and tucked a strand of loose hair behind his ears. He clasped his hands behind his back. James suddenly coughed up a spurt of blood on the ground and turned a swollen eye to the old man before him.
Max.
The words dribbled out of the man's bleeding mouth. The old man's expression softened.
James, my boy, my old friend. I never wanted things to go this way. Surely you understand that.
Max.
The old man seemed to grow suddenly agitated.
I sensed a corrupting presence in these children from the moment I entered the woods. It would seem that the McEnroses have been deviating from the path I set before them. They have been experimenting, toying with a power they can't begin to understand. For that, they will pay most dearly.
The last sentence was spoken with dark conviction.
Although I suppose there is only one branch left to that tree, unless Sully is already out here somewhere, growing cold like these two here.
He motioned towards the two prostrate bodies. James held his stomach and let out a low groan. He spoke something in an unintelligible whisper. The old man began to draw near. A low, cynical chuckle escaped him.
James, you are a maelstrom. I realize that through my actions, your life has been disrupted. But on God, I never expected you to go to these lengths. I have arrived at the conclusion that you are a good father. If you live, you may take Max home.
Max.
The old man stood now in front of James, and he held out a hand of beckoning.
Come now. Let's find the boy and leave this place.
James' head rolled back, and his eyes slowly focused on the old man's open palm. Then his head slumped forward again. The old man sighed. Then he bent forward and opened his arms to help James to his feet. In a lightning-fast motion, James sat up and his arm whipped out wide. Moonlight glinted off a flash of steel. James stopped, with his arm out wide to his right, and he looked into the old man's eyes. Blood began to drizzle onto the ground between the old man's feet. The old man's face contorted into a hideous grimace. His lips smacked wordlessly together as his eyes fixed on James.
You!
The old man brought down both of his fists onto James' head, and the man folded to the ground. Blow after blow landed on the prostrate figure, until finally, the old man flipped him over and closed his hands around his throat. The old man's blood was draining slowly onto James' chest. James gave several feeble kicks at the earth, and then was still. The old man slowly picked himself up and stood over James' body. He spoke haltingly, in almost a whisper.
End of an era, Corey. End of an era.
The end of episode 11. This has been Seat of the Allfather. Join us next time for the exciting finale, episode 12.